From the Blind Ability Studios, it's Wellness Wednesday with your hosts, Beth Gustin and Robin Ennis.
A boundary is a way that you're protecting yourself, as well as kind of teaching someone else what your limits are, or teaching someone else what you're okay with and not okay with. But really, it's to protect you.
It is an unhealthy relationship is when those boundaries aren't respected and you feel like you have to repeat yourself over and over again.
If you're changing the steps of a dance, the other people in your system are going to have no choice but to follow you or change their dance steps. It can be scary to set a boundary and create change. It can be hard for us to enforce or hold them. And so I think it's important to think about, okay, if I set a boundary and it's not held or not respected, what can I do to enforce it?
Welcome to Wellness Wednesday. My name is Robin Ennis, a licensed clinical social worker in the state of Colorado, and I'm here with my co-host, Beth Gustin, also a licensed professional counselor in the state of Colorado. And so today our topic is going to be boundaries, which is definitely a hard one. It comes up a lot in my practice, how to set and maintain boundaries. Whenever we find ourselves trying to do that, you may get some pushback and say, you're just being mean, or how can you say that, right? But the definition of boundaries is more so creating limits. Those can be, whether it's physical boundaries, right? We learned that during COVID when we had to have the 6 feet social distancing. That was a physical boundary. We have emotional boundaries, that level of respect, making sure that you treat other people kindly and with compassion. And there's a lot of boundaries. There's financial boundaries, whatever it may be, but it's really creating those limits for yourself so that you can be able to navigate healthy relationships and be comfortable with yourself in the process.
I echo everything that you just said about what a boundary is. Another way I explain boundaries to my clients, because we also discuss this frequently in my work with clients, is a boundary is a way that you're protecting yourself, as well as kind of teaching someone else what your limits are, or teaching someone else what you're okay with and not okay with. But really, it's to protect you. And so if you can think about it from that standpoint, I think it helps clients feel more comfortable in setting a boundary, because it really is about us getting our needs met in a way that's healthy and constructive, and hopefully eventually a win-win for both people involved. And boundaries can look a lot of different ways. There can be really rigid boundaries where you're not crossing this line. There can be a flexible boundary where maybe it depends on who can cross that line. We want to make sure the boundaries aren't too loose though, because like I said, we set them, at least in my mind, to really help ourselves navigate situations. Not for someone else, but for us.
Right, because the more boundaries that you have with other people, I believe that can promote more self-care. Because when there are those too loose of boundaries, then some people may feel like they're being taken advantage of, or people are walking over them. And that's where stress can start to build up, or burnout starts to build up, anger, resentment, whatever it may feel. So like Beth mentioned, it really is about taking care of you and setting boundaries. Again, it's not being mean. It's actually, honestly, it's teaching other people how to treat you, like what Beth was saying earlier. And I supervise employees who are getting their licensure in social work. And one employee had mentioned for her, setting boundaries means saying no. And that's a hard thing to do. And when she's able to do it, it creates a sense of relief. It makes her feel better because she feels like she's not overextending herself. And so during the month of November, right? That's when she really tries to stick to that boundary of saying no, and it's okay to do that, and reminding herself of that. So every time I think of November, I think of her philosophy of saying no whenever you feel like you don't want to do something, or you feel like you're overextending yourself.
Like that. It also comes to mind to kind of help set boundaries and get a better understanding of them. And I'm not getting paid to recommend this book, but I do like Nedra Tawwab's book, Set Boundaries, Find Peace. And if you've not read that book, each chapter talks about different types of boundaries you can set with different groups of people, whether it's friends or coworkers or parents or partners. And I think it's really, really good at explaining what is a boundary, And it gives you some really good language on how you can state a boundary that hopefully other people will hear and respect.
I really like that. And I think the title says it within itself. I find it helpful, with any books that tell what a problem is and ways to be able to resolve that problem can be helpful. So I could see how that could be beneficial to clients. It's really, again, going back to being in tune with yourself. And if you feel like your boundaries are being crossed, one way, going back to what we've repeatedly mentioned, is that paying attention to your body, right? So noticing what body reactions you have whenever you feel like your boundaries are being crossed, because then that lets you know, hey, I don't feel good about this, and what can I do about it? And being able to try and figure out how to be able to approach that person about it and make corrective actions in the future so that you won't feel whatever feeling that you're having.
Exactly. And I think when it comes to actually setting boundaries, it's important to figure out what is it about the situation that's not working for you, and what do you want to see differently? And if you can articulate what you want to see differently, what can you do to state that need and start to set a boundary so that that can change and things can hopefully be better and flow more smoothly for you?
Yep. One example that comes to mind also too is the boundary for privacy. That tends to be a big issue of my clients who have physical disabilities. It's that they feel like their loved ones need to know where they are all of the time, and they feel like they don't have any privacy or any space just to be. And so one particular client, I said, well, what would it be like if you just told, and I get the concern, but what would it be if you just told your family member, hey, I'll be back, and leave it at that, right? You don't have to explain or justify where you're going, just letting them know that you'll be back. And if something goes wrong, you have your phone, and you'll be in contact or in touch. Because I feel like that's an example of being assertive, but also to creating that boundary of that right to privacy, that right to autonomy.
Exactly. And I think if you're getting pushback on setting that boundary, maybe it's having a conversation to say, hey, yes, I know I'm living with a disability and I'm an adult. And so I would like the autonomy to go where I need to go when I need to be there without having to explain where I'm going, who I'm with, when I'm going to be back, because other adults don't have to do that. And so I'd like to be treated the same.
Yes, exactly.
Again, we don't want to justify, from our last conversation, but sometimes I think explaining the need for the boundary can help the other person respect it better if they know where it's coming from.
I agree. I can create more clarity, like you mentioned, to have a better understanding of where you're coming from. Sometimes too is, well, how would you feel if you were in my situation? Putting it back on the person in that retrospect, especially going back to the disability example. How would they feel if the roles were reversed? Yeah, I do think that having that level of justification with also to the I feel statements. I feel frustrated when I feel like I don't have enough privacy or autonomy. I'm wondering, how would you feel if you had to regularly explain where you're going? That way it uses the I feel, and it helps the other person be able to have perspective and to be able to understand, oh yeah, well, I guess I would feel frustrated too.
Exactly. And again, we only can explain so much, but I think if we can make an effort to explain the reason behind why we're asking for a change, it definitely makes things go smoother in most cases. I always tell my clients, if you're changing the steps of a dance, the other people in your system are going to have no choice but to follow you or change their dance steps. And so I know it can be scary to set a boundary and create change, but usually what we find in healthy relationships is that it goes relatively smoothly and people respect it and we move forward. It gets very tricky when it comes to unhealthy relationships because boundaries are not always respected and it can be hard for us to enforce or hold them. And so I think it's important to think about, okay, if I set a boundary and it's not held or not respected, what can I do to enforce it? And that's why I brought up sometimes explaining the reasoning behind the boundary can be helpful because it can hopefully help the other person see the need for it. But if they don't, then I think sometimes we do what Robin just said, which was, well, just say you're going to be back and leave it at that and go do it anyway.
Yes, and so I do like the dance analogy that you used, Beth. And so if you think about it, yes, it can be a dance and they will eventually learn how to follow. And so the key word is eventually. So sometimes they may stumble or mess up the moves, and it takes time, it takes practice. So it's not going to run smoothly initially, but again, the more that you stick to those boundaries, the more that they realize, hey, they'll have to really get back in line and practice those moves to really start to understand where you're coming from. And I know in the last podcast, we had talked about don't justify or explain in terms of unhealthy relationships. So it's okay to, I feel, to some extent, like Beth mentioned, is to explain and justify the reasoning behind you needing these boundaries, but also to don't make it where you feel like you have to repeatedly do that. Like Beth mentioned, that's how you can know when it is an unhealthy relationship, is when those boundaries aren't respected and you feel like you have to repeat yourself over and over again.
Exactly. So as we're winding down the podcast, again, we're always curious to hear your thoughts on our topics and what would be helpful and relevant for us to cover going forward. And what would it be like if we had people share, like when you set a boundary, what was the experience like? What made it go well? And invite more feedback?
Yeah, that's good. I like that.
Yeah, we always welcome your feedback, whether it's future topic suggestions or if a topic was helpful to you. And we also invite you to share, in the comments, have you set a boundary before and what went well, what didn't go well? Maybe you can help other people out with your experiences.
Exactly, because we all learn from each other, right? Again, we would love to hear from you. So please definitely let us know if you have any answers to the questions that Beth mentioned, or if you have any topics that you want us to talk about. We definitely want to hear from you. Until next time, take care.
Have a good week.
You can send Beth and Robin a message at 612-367-6093 or by email at info@blindabilities.com. They'd love to hear from you.
When we share
what we see
through each other's eyes, we can then begin to bridge the gap
between the limited expectations and the realities
of blind abilities.
And the realities of blind abilities.